and I get bored easily. We'll start chapter 2 today since I'm supposed to start chapter 3. I'm only behind by a chapter. If you're a St. Louis Cardinals fan, you may remember the 2002 season. Darryl Kile died during the season. He was only 33 years old. He had a heart attack and died. And of course, if you're a St. Louis Cardinals fan, you were one of the things you may have been saying was somebody murdered him. I think one of those giant guys, one of those Chicago Cub people, murdered Darryl Kile because he was such a dominating pitcher. He had a massive heart attack, and of course, he was 33 years old, so he was at the peak of his physical capabilities. And of course, at this point, this is in 2002, and people that don't like to exercise are going, aha, if you exercise, it'll kill you. So I'm not going to exercise. There were a lot of people that said that. One of them was my sister. My mother thought she was dead when she was a baby, when she was in the womb, because she never moved. And my sister lived her entire life hardly ever moving. She was that kind of a person. And of course, she had four younger brothers, and we moved constantly. She thought we all were ADHD because we moved so much and made so much noise. But she never moved. She'd just sit in her chair and read, or she'd sit in her chair, hardly ever watch television. She hated television. So she claimed that exercising made you fat. Her point was that if you created muscles and you stopped exercising, your muscles have turned to fat. That was her idea. Anyway. So there were a lot of people out there saying, oh my goodness gracious, exercising isn't good for you. If Darryl Kile died, then maybe anybody can die from exercise. After weeks of speculation about drug abuse and even murder, it was disclosed that Kile had a family history of heart disease. His father had died at 44 from a heart attack, which is kind of young. 44 is still kind of young. Kile had 90% blockage in 2 coronary arteries. Well, I had the same blockage that he did, except I only had 1 artery that was blocked. And mine was 93% occluded. And I didn't die, but he did. Well, he had 2 coronary arteries that were blocked. Anyway, so he didn't eat very well. Okay, so that's Darryl Kile. Let's talk about Jim Fixx. You guys don't remember Jim Fixx, but I do, because I was alive in the 1970s and 1980s, and he was the first jogging guru. He claimed that it changed his life, and it really did change his life. You can see how skinny the guy is. Of course, he was skinny to begin with, but it changed his life. He was kind of a boozer. He's kind of didn't eat very healthy. All of a sudden, he starts jogging, and he became obsessive compulsive about the entire lifestyle. So here's Jim Fixx. He's in his 40s. He had lived a sedentary lifestyle up to this point. He wrote books about it, made millions and millions of dollars. I know, writing books. Jim Fixx. There's one of the books, The Complete Book of Running by Jim Fixx, James E. Fixx. At the age of 43, Fixx dropped dead of a heart attack while jogging in Vermont. The story went that he leaned over to tie his shoes. These are Asics. He was the first guy to wear Asics shoes. But at that point they weren't called Asics, they were called Onitsukas. They were Japanese shoes. Almost everybody's running shoes came from Germany at the time, Puma or Adidas. And he's the one that brought Asics over to the United States. Or Onitsukas, they were Onitsukas to begin with. Anyway, so he dropped over dead. The story went that he leaned over to tie one of his shoes, and he just collapsed on the floor. But he died in Vermont. The world of running was shocked, and the sedentary people pointed to his death as proof that exercise couldn't and wouldn't help you. That if you were going to die, you're going to die anyway. And exercise didn't help you at all. But then it was disclosed that Fixx had been a sedentary smoker. And one of the reasons, this didn't come out for a long time. And the reason it didn't come out was because they were still trying to sell his books. They're also trying to sell the damn shoes. And they didn't want anybody to, they didn't want the optic to change. They wanted it to be the same. But then finally it came out. People that had known him before, you know, these things come out. People that had known him before said, no, he was a jerk before he started running. He was a smoker. He had a horrible, horrible diet where he ate just tons and tons of high-fat and high-cholesterol foods. And of course, these things, this stuff clogs you up. What you did in the past will never go away. If you smoked and you damaged yourself, that damage will never be repaired. If you ate a lot of high cholesterol foods 10 years ago, well, some of that cholesterol is still in there. And you've got to be, eventually that stuff's going to come back and haunt you. It will. Now, by exercising, you may be increasing the probability that you'll live longer, but all the damage that you've done is still there, and it will never be repaired. Your lungs may be better, but if you've already taken 10 years off your life, you'll never get those 10 years back. I ruptured my spleen in 1985. They told me at the time, this probably takes 10 years off your life. I can never put those 10 years back on. There's nothing I can do about it. It's already gone. If I smoked for 5 years, which I didn't, but if I had smoked for 5 years, the damage that tobacco did to my body is still there, and there's nothing I can do. I can reverse it. I can make my body better now, but I can never get all that time back. It just does not happen. The other problem that Jim Fixx had was that he was a workaholic. And of course, everybody thought, oh, you know, type A personalities, they're the successful people of the world. Yep, they're the successful people of the world, but they also die young of heart attacks because they're so hostile. They work all the time, they don't get enough sleep. And you need to get enough sleep. Sleep is when you repair yourself. So if this guy's a workaholic, no matter what he does in the future, he's not repairing himself properly. If he's running whatever he's running during the day, he needs to repair himself. And the only way to do that is to go to sleep. Is to sleep. Those 7 or 8 hours that you sleep, you are repairing yourself. So if you don't get proper sleep, you don't do the proper, the reparations don't take place, and potentially you're going to die young. So the only way we discovered this about Darryl Kile and Jim Fixx was through research. We looked at they were both case studies. They both died young. So if we look at just these 2 cases, then you may be telling yourself, oh my God, exercise doesn't do you any good at all. I can tell you that it saved my life, but we have 2 examples of 2 very healthy specimens, and these individuals died young. So can we do that? Can we take 2 examples and make that, and say that that is representative of everybody? Of course not. Of course we
It's not valid, or there's no validity.
Exactly. 2 doesn't make a very good standard, does it? So we need to use critical thinking, and critical thinking has to be part of your research, has to be part of your daily life. You should be thinking critically about everything. If you read a news story on the internet about Roger Stone or Donald Trump, you need to use critical thinking. Is this accurate? Are these people just haters of Donald Trump, or are they lovers of Donald Trump? You need to ask yourself that question. You need to use critical thinking in everything that you do. So what is critical thinking? It's questioning approach to information that doesn't blindly accept conclusions. You should question everything. Even if you agree with it, you still need to question it. You need to examine underlying assumptions. You need to evaluate the evidence as best that you can, whatever evidence that you have. Belief bias is a form of faulty reasoning in which our expectations prevent us from seeing alternative explanations for our observations. And I'm going to give you an example in just a second. We may see cause and effect where there is an effect, but the cause is not certain. Or at least there isn't enough information to determine cause. Okay, let me give you an example. Pleuro. Pleuro has been around forever. It's ugly. It's your skin, you lose all your skin, and then you die. Ooh. The people that get pellagra more than anybody else are poor people. So they thought it had something to do with bacteria. Yeah, your skin sloughs off, your teeth loosen, and then you die. Eventually you die. It was a common problem throughout history and continued into the 20th century, even in the United States. But not to everybody in the United States, only to poor people in the United States. So what does it have to do with poverty? That was the question. This is what it looks like on your face. I know that looks like lupus, but that's what pellagra looks like. It was long assumed that since people living in poverty had poor hygiene, the problem was caused by a fecal-borne bacteria similar to cholera and dysentery. However, Joseph Goldberger noticed that the problem was more pronounced when a population ate the same non-nutritious foods. So everybody thought it was bacterial-borne, that it was a bacteria. But Goldberger said, wait a minute, when they eat this bad food, then they seem to get pellagra. So maybe it has something to do with nutrition. Now remember, we're talking about doctors arguing with each other. So in the 1860s, if somebody had asked you where pellagra came from, you would think, well, you'd say, well, it has to do with the water that they drink. It has to do with the water that they bathe in. Potentially there's sewage in that water. Therefore, these individuals are coming down with pellagra, and that's where it comes from. And if you read all the medical books say exactly the same thing. If you read any of the journals, it says exactly the same thing. Remember, doctors operate by protocol. Each doctor knows this is true. And the reason they know it's true is because some other doctor told them it was true. Okay. That's the way medicine works. That way you don't have to try to discover everything for yourself. Also, think of all the stuff there is in medicine. So now all you have to do is memorize all this stuff. And now you got all the answers. That's the way college professors work too. These are all the right answers. I'm giving this to you, therefore it's the right answer. I have a PhD, therefore everything I think is right. You may think that I'm wrong, but you're wrong because I'm right. I'm always right. And I will test you on the stuff that I know is right. All right? That's the way it works. And that's the way medicine works too, unfortunately. And sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes doctors are incorrect. We had no clue where HIV came from. And the doctors were speculating, and some of them didn't even want to touch it. So they'd send it to somebody else because they have no clue what's going on. And then eventually, of course, we figured out it was that horrible virus. Anyway, okay, so we've got Goldberger, and he's out there. He needs to do research, so he did. He experimented on prison inmates. Back at this time, of course, you could do that. You could experiment on prison inmates. Goldberger was able to prove that pellagra was a result of niacin or vitamin 3 deficiency. Vitamin B3 deficiency. Before that, they thought it was a bacterial infection. But he proved that it was a vitamin B3 deficiency. But we still have a problem. But it took several more decades before doctors accepted his findings because it would have meant social change in states that didn't want to take responsibility for their poor. So it's not only a medical question, but it's also a political question. And we have individuals that don't want to deal with that because they don't want to have to do anything about their poor. This is the same way that it worked with mental health in the United States. We had states that didn't want to have anything to do with mental health. They didn't want to have to pay for these guys. So they didn't open mental hospitals. If they did, they'd have to pay for it. And nobody wanted to pay for it. It's the same way with education in Arizona. Same way with education in Florida. They don't want to pay for it. Most of the people that live in this state are retired. They're on fixed incomes. They don't want to pay for somebody else's kids. Does all that make sense? This is one of the problems in Arizona. It's one of the problems in Florida. It's one of the problems in New Mexico. We have so many retired people. They don't want to pay. They don't want to pay more money for education. So the education in this state, the education in New Mexico, the education in Florida is not as good as it is in other states. If you're trying to take care of your own kids and trying to educate your own kids, then you will pay anything that you can. You don't mind paying taxes to educate your kids. You're not only educating your kids, but you're also educating other kids. So let's have higher taxes so that we get good education in this state. Does that make sense? So when the retired people control the politics in a state, they don't want to pay more money for education. So the education tends to be poor in that state. Let's take a state like Mississippi. Mississippi doesn't have hardly any retired people, but what's the problem in Mississippi? Well, the problem in Mississippi is that about a third of the state's population is African American. White people don't want to educate black kids. They do want to educate their own kids, but they don't want to educate black kids. They're not their kids. They're different. Their skin's darker. They have a different culture. They have a different mindset. They watch Cops and they know that all the criminals are black and Hispanic. Turns out they're all black and Hispanic. So they don't want to educate them. So what do? The federal government tells them they have to educate the white kids and black kids together. So what do? They open private schools to educate their kids in. Public schools are still, they can't do anything about the public schools. The federal government told them they had to educate blacks and whites together. I know. Isn't this bizarre? So we're resegregating the South through their education. Anyway, so we've got this problem. So we've got a political problem. We've also got a medical problem. But who's dying here? Who's dying? It's poor people. Who gives a shit about poor people? Not the rich people, obviously. Look at the tax break they just gave the wealthy people in the United States. Who cares about poor people? Unless your ox is being gored, you don't really care. Those old people, the old people in Arizona, Florida, and New Mexico, who have all that political power, they've already educated their kids. Their grandkids don't live in that state. These are snowbirds. These are people that live someplace else. Their grandkids live up in Minnesota or New York State. So they're not going to pay anything. They don't want to educate the kids in Arizona, New Mexico, and Florida. They don't have to. They've already educated their kids. Their grandkids are being educated in another state with better education. So they don't want to pay taxes down here. That's the way it works. And it's the same way that it worked with Goldberger. He couldn't convince the medical community that it was important enough to change their ideas. So in the medical books, it still said that Pleuro was caused by a fecal-borne bacteria. It's sewage. It's not vitamin B3 deficiency. All they needed to do was give them better food. Well, what kind of food do you have to give somebody to have B3 in it? What kind of foods have B3? Anybody have a clue? Avocados, of course. Peanuts have vitamin B3. Peas have vitamin B3. Beans, primarily it's beans. Okay, anyway. So it took forever, and the medical community wouldn't accept it because it's really hard to change things. Despite the fact that we know that doctors are prescribing too many painkillers, they're not stopping. We've been talking about this for 4 or 5 years. Stop giving everybody so much OxyContin. But the protocol is in there and they can't stop. Are they addicted? No, the protocol tells them they have to do this. If they don't do that, then they might be sued. So despite the fact they're addicting people in the United States, they won't stop. And it's still going on. And also, other people make a lot of money. The pharmaceutical companies are making a lot of money. And money always dictates what's going to happen next. Epidemiology is a scientific study of the frequency, distribution, and causes of a particular disease or other health outcomes in a population. We have two outbreaks going on in the United States right now. One of them is the flu epidemic. Of course, we have a flu epidemic every year. Seems like the flu shot didn't work even a little bit this time. We've got 12 states that are closing schools because of the flu epidemic. Now the interesting, and maybe you guys don't care, 12 states are closing their schools because there's so much flu in the area. And of course, you know, you've got 1,000 cases of the flu. How many people are going to die from that? Well, maybe 3 or 4. Maybe little guys and maybe old farts. But they're closing the schools because they have half of all the classes are homesick. Now the interesting thing is that the farthest west state that is closing schools is Texas. Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas have all closed their schools because of the flu epidemic. But there's another epidemic going on in the United States. And this one has to do with arguments between people that want to inoculate and people that think that it's too dangerous for them to inoculate their children. It's the measles. We're having another measles outbreak in the United States. Measles kills people. But we can inoculate your children from the measles. We can do that. We can give them a shot and they'll never get the measles. Neither of my kids ever had the measles. I inoculated them. I had the measles 3 times. I still have scars on the palms of my hands from the measles. I know. Weird. I've got red splotches on the palms of my hands from measles. It can kill you. You get a fever that won't go away. You have a fever that you can't take anything for. You can take aspirin, it doesn't work. You've got to. If you can live through the fever, then you'll live through the measles. They have to do things like give you an alcohol wash or put you in an ice bath, which is the most god awful thing you can possibly imagine. Anyway. So we have two problems in the United States right now. One of them has to do with the flu, and the other has to do with measles. Psychologists conduct research in 2 major categories, descriptive studies and experimental studies. Experimental studies have to do with, we're going to study something, but it may not be applicable. But descriptive studies usually are looking at problems that potentially are there. They're descriptive. Health psychologists add 2 further types of research. They do epidemiological studies where they look at the frequency of a disease, or the frequency of a problem. We were doing this in Korea. We did an epidemiological study in Korea, and the problem was that there were guys coming down with gonorrhea. Now, how do you get gonorrhea? Where does gonorrhea come from? You have sex with somebody that has gonorrhea. Okay.
So a trick question or something.
It was a trick question. There was an easy answer, but nobody wanted to give it to me. Okay, so the question was, what are they going to do? How are they going to keep guys from getting gonorrhea? Well, we could give them all condoms. That'll help, maybe. We can restrict them to the bays, so that they don't visit prostitutes. That'll work. Okay. And of course, they decided not to do that. The people downtown didn't want them to do that because they were making too much money off the GIs. So they started distributing condoms. It reduced it a little bit. Well, it reduced it some, but it didn't. They don't always use condoms. It was a problem. Anyway, epidemiological study. They did an epidemiological study. Eventually, what they did was the women that were causing the problem, They didn't, it's not like they told them not to have sex anymore, but they brought them in and they started treating them for gonorrhea. Okay. All right. And they changed everything. I mean, it was lovely, everything changed. They would bring them in weekly for a weekly examination. It was a health check, is what they call it. They call it a health check. So they got free medical care. And the women thought it was great because they got free medical care. Can't beat that. They also gave them birth control pills, which is kind of interesting. And the other is meta-analysis. Epidemiological studies, we just look at one single problem. With meta-analysis, we look at a lot of different studies in the same area. And that's how we discovered that 12 states are closing their schools because of the flu epidemic right now, using meta-analysis. Texas has theirs. The states are mostly in the east. Texas, Oklahoma, and Alabama. Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama. Most of them are in the south. As curious as that is. Now, why in the world would the south have more problems with the flu than the north? What's the difference between people in the south and people in the north?
Population.
Temperature.
Temperature. Population, no, there's a lot of crowded stuff, but yeah, temperature. Temperature has a lot to do with it. One of the things we know about health and disease is that if you sleep in a cold room, then you're healthier than if you sleep in a warm room. Because most bacteria are fairly fastidious. Their temperature is very important to them. So if you sleep in a cold room, at some point during the night, your temperature will go down automatically. When you're asleep, it automatically goes down. Well, if you're sleeping in a warm room, then your temperature doesn't go down very far. But if you're sleeping in a cold room, then it goes down much, much farther. And since most bacteria and viruses are fairly fastidious as far as temperature is concerned, then they can't survive in that environment. So the people that live in Montana don't get the flu nearly as much as people who live in Mississippi. Dr. Wolf was bragging about the temperature down in the valley over the weekend. Evidently it was in the 70s. Of course, I'm sleeping in a house where I've got my thermostat set on 60. So it's cold in my house. It doesn't bother me. Dogs don't mind. My wife minded a little bit this weekend. She was only there for a couple days. What the hell? Let her suffer for 2 days. Now here's the sad thing. My wife is flying back to Iowa. Iowa is below zero right now, and they won't be above zero for 2 weeks. And they're supposed to get snow through those 2 weeks. So she's flying back not only to a blizzard, but also to Arctic temperatures. And I feel sorry for her too. Of course, I love that kind of weather. I think it's great. Have a good time in that kind of weather. Health psychology methods, descriptive studies. They're often conducted in the field, of course. They may include case studies, sometimes surveys, interviewing select individuals, naturalistic observation, just watching how people interact. One way that you could do that, how many people wash their hands in the restrooms. The problem in the restrooms isn't the fact that you've peed on your hands. That's not the real problem. The real problem is that other individuals have touched things that you need to clean off your hands. So if you touch things when you go into the restroom, then potentially you need to wash your hands. Okay. Or if you have a bowel movement, you have to wash your hands. If you wiped yourself, then you need to wash your hands. Descriptive studies permit the gathering of in-depth information that often leads to new hypotheses. There is no direct control over variables, of course, because it's naturalistic observation, so you can't control the variables. Unfortunately, they are subject to the bias of the observer. So if I'm looking for something, specific, guess what? I'm going to see it. They had a study where they were looking at violence on the school playground. They're looking at violence on the school playground. How much violence is there? How much running and hitting people is going on? How much touching of each other is going on the school playground. They were looking for violence, and they found lots and lots and lots of it. Well, the question was, how did they define violence? The kids didn't, nobody was hurt, no bloody noses, no broken arms, no anger even. There was just a lot of running and jumping and playing and laughing, but they defined it as violence because that was part of their criteria. So sometimes the bias of the observer creates a problem, can create a problem. And of course, anytime you look at any research, you need to think critically about what they've done. This is one of the reasons why I ask you to do this whenever you read read a paper, read a research article. You need to determine if that was a good piece of research. The reality is, and don't tell Sarah or Sue that I said this, but the reality is a lot of research is pure crap. It's not accurate at all. It doesn't mean anything. It's inaccurate. And a lot of it has to do with observer bias. They just want to write an article. They need to write an article in order to keep their job. Who knows who they are? Are they like us? Do they have the same mindset that we do? No, maybe they see violence as yelling at someone. Maybe that's violence to them. But the reality is, you go to France, my God, everybody yells at everybody else. That's the way they talk to each other. They talk really loud. Okay, are they yelling? No, they're just conversing, but they seem to have a high volume when they talk. So you have to look at the research. You have to determine if that research is any good, if there's any biases in that research. So you can't look at any research and just accept it without thinking about it. No matter what it says, even if it agrees with you, you've got to read the research and you have to think critically about it. Okay. Sometimes people don't like that because they want you to accept everything. Single cases may be misleading, so you have to be careful as far as that goes. Case studies are conducted when there is a seemingly representative case, and this case is studied thoroughly over an extended length of time. The first HIV case, for example. The first guy that came down with HIV. Of course, the first guy that came down with HIV, we had no idea what it was. So when this guy died, everybody's going, why did he die? And everybody else is going, I don't know. I thought he had the flu, that kind of stuff. So that wasn't really the first case. It was the first case, but it wasn't the first one anybody looked at. They looked at the third case, or maybe the fifth case. By the fifth case, they realized they had something that was similar to everything else. Was it the doctors that noticed this? Hell no. The doctors they see the patients for 5 minutes. Do they know what's going on? No, it's the nurses that know what's going on. It's the people that actually take care of the cases. Hopefully there was a nurse that noticed that these guys all came down with the same problems, they had the same diseases, they had the same reactions. They're the ones that noticed that there was a commonality between this guy, and this guy. So the third case may have become the case study, or the fifth case, or hopefully it wasn't the 25th case, or the 99th case, or the 500th case. Hopefully they're not so stupid and so blind that they missed all of those people dying without thinking about it. Potentially all these cases went to the medical examiner, and of course he did autopsies on all these individuals. This is before they put all the stuff on, and potentially came down with it as well. But hopefully, when he looked at it, he wasn't thinking in the same mindset. One of the problems we have is that we create boxes, and we put things in these little boxes, and we try not to think outside these little boxes. There are people out there that are obsessive compulsive, and to them, their life is a box, and everything has to be fit into their box, and they never think outside that box. We need innovative thinkers. That's what we need. Let me tell you a quick story. I'm the hero in this story. but it's... I'm sure you've heard this story before. We had the little girl that came in with diarrhea. I know, it's a poop story, I apologize. Anyways, this little girl had diarrhea, and it was horrible. I mean, this poor thing was just squirting all over the place. Of course, we're medics, so we're used to this kind of stuff, you know, bedpans and feces and whatnot. So she had diarrhea. Well, the first thing you do with diarrhea is that you check it for the normal things that people have diarrhea for. Is it something she ate? No, she's been squirting for 2 days. Obviously, it's not the food that she's eating because she hasn't eaten for 2 days. And she's got this very liquid diarrhea. So we cultured it to see if we could see anything in there. We looked at it for parasites. This was in Texas. So there's a possibility there's amoeba, because there's amoeba in the water supply in Texas. Not Clonalepis sinensis, what is it? Giardia lamblia. It's one of the amoebas that they have over there. So we looked at it for an amoeba, and we couldn't find anything. We cultured it, nothing grew. Wait a minute, stool specimens, something always grows in a stool specimen. No, this little girl's got no growth on her stool specimen. And the doctors, of course, are going, I have no clue. I've never seen this before. They're looking at the protocols, and protocols say something's always growing in the stool specimen. But they said, they didn't think anything about it because it's bacteria. It's the type of bacteria causes the problem. If there's a lack of that bacteria, it can't possibly be what's causing the problem. So this poor little thing is, I don't know if you understand how diarrhea works, but diarrhea will dehydrate you very, very rapidly. So one of the things that we had to do was put IVs in this poor little thing. She's only 12. She was a 12-year-old. So we're sticking IVs. She's got IVs in one in her scalp. She's got 2 in her arms. Then we start them in her legs because we're trying to keep her hydrated. And of course, she's dying because she's dehydrating herself to death. She's literally squirting herself to death. We're not feeding her anything to make sure that she doesn't have a reaction to the food, but she's getting all of her fluids through the IV bags. And we're giving her D5W, we're giving her saline. And the doctor's pulling out his hair because he can't figure out what's going on. And he's reading everything. He's reading pediatric journals. He's reading pediatric books. It could be this parasite from North Korea. Oh yeah, right. It's going to be a parasite from North Korea in Lubbock, Texas. Maybe a North Korean came and gave this little girl parasites. No, that can't be it. And so he says, is it Shigella? Is it Salmonella? Is it E. coli infection? No, she's got no growth on any of her plates. So I wasn't working in microbiology at the time. I was working someplace else, but I was in charge of the lab. So I went back to look, and we had this female military person working in micro, and she just went berserk. She took leave because she couldn't handle it. This little girl's dying and she can't find it. So I went in and I cleaned up after her, tried to make sure that everything had been looked at. And we looked at this stool specimen and we grew it again and nothing's growing. So finally I looked at the stool specimen, but I wasn't really looking for parasites. I just wanted to see what was in there. And it was almost pure water. I mean, this poor little thing is just squirting pure water. But it looked like she had white cells in there. And I said, wait a minute, you're not supposed to have white cells. Why would she have white cells without any red cells? That doesn't make any sense. Does she have some kind of an infection going on in her intestinal tract? So I looked at these things and they didn't really look like white cells. They were a little bit bigger than white cells. So I said, maybe they're yeast. So I put it in a germ tube to grow yeast, and lo and behold, it was Candida albicans. Now, Candida albicans doesn't cause any problem in your stool. All of us have Candida albicans in our stool right now. Of course, we have so much bacteria in there that the Candida albicans can't grow. But she didn't have any bacteria growing. So she had Candida albicans exploding in her intestinal tract. It was causing her intestines to spasm, and that's why she couldn't stop squirting. So I told the doctor, and he said, that can't be. I can't find it in any of the journals. It's not there. It can't possibly be that problem. I said, well, what choice do we have? Let's go ahead and treat it. Go ahead and treat her for it. And they did. They treated her for it, and her diarrhea stopped that quick. And they fed her yogurt, to put normal flora back in her gut. I know. Saved her life. She was hours away from dying. She was hours away from pooping herself to death, as sad as that is. And I'm kind of the hero, but of course nothing ever happened. They didn't say, oh, wonderful stuff. He's the most wonderful laboratory technician in the world. No, I just thought outside the box. It didn't make any sense to me that she would have this stuff. And so I had to convince the doctor, who thinks in little boxes, and that little box has to do with that medical book that he read, or all these journals that he read. This is all the medical knowledge. The strange part was he was Taiwanese, he was Chinese. And he's used to thinking outside the box, but he's used to thinking inside a Chinese box. So he couldn't think outside the box. Okay, that's my box story. Yeah, it makes it look like I'm a hero, but of course, nobody's a hero when we're talking about diarrhea. Okay, I know. We're talking about poop. It's not something that we do. Anyway, okay, so case study, that's what you're looking for. So, and he wrote it up in a medical journal. You know how much credit I got? None, absolutely none. What did he say? One of my technicians noticed that it was, my name wasn't mentioned. It was kind of a jerky thing to do. Anyway, he wrote it up, and he became famous. And I certainly didn't become famous, but he wouldn't have become famous if I hadn't found it, damn it. Anyway, so I think there's a disease named after him. Dr. Chin. Because the researcher is able to make a more extensive observation, the conclusions can be more involved. At the beginning of an outbreak, the first case or cases will be studied in depth, and that's usually the way it works. That's the way it worked with the Ebola virus. Ebola is evolving, by the way. So the next time we see it, and actually there was an outbreak in Nigeria not very long ago, but they were able to arrest it. They slowed it down. They kept it in one village. What do you do with an Ebola outbreak? You make everybody move out of the village, make sure that they're not infected. They move out of the village, and then you burn the village down, because there's not a whole lot you can do about it. I don't know if you understand how Ebola works. You bleed from your eyes, you bleed from your nose, you bleed from all of anything that's open, you bleed from your anus certainly, but that blood is contaminated with the Ebola virus. So any discharge coming out of that guy is pathogenic. So you have to burn the bodies. I mean, you don't really have much choice. How long does the Ebola virus last? Well, until you burn it, it's still alive. So what they have to do when they have an Ebola outbreak, is they have to burn the village and they have to burn all the bodies. So what if that goes against your culture? What if it goes against your culture? What do you do? What do you do then? Still do it anyway. We don't care. We'll destroy your culture. We don't care, as long as we don't get sick with the Ebola virus. Surveys examine individual attitudes and beliefs. Surveys are less in depth than case studies. Larger numbers can be surveyed, of course, and this is what you're doing. No, you're not in this class. It's social psych. I'm sorry. Social psych. I'm having people take surveys every week. But you can survey just millions and millions of people if you like. Surveys are conducted as self-report measures. So as long as people aren't liars, then we're okay. Well, but turns out everybody's a liar. So surveys are not very accurate. They don't have to be accurate. They're not necessarily accurate. The sequence and the wording of the questions can change the attitudes of the subjects taking the survey. If you get a survey from the Democrats and a survey from the Republicans, I can promise you that the questions are very similar. However, the way that the Democrats word their surveys points toward, I want you to answer it the way you would if you were a Democrat, and the Republicans do exactly the same thing. So when they talk about their surveys aren't accurate. They're just trying to get you to donate money to the party. But usually the news agencies, their surveys are pretty good. They word them correctly. They're not aimed in one direction or another. So they tend to be fairly accurate. However, we still have a problem. It's a thing called the halo effect. Most people, when they take surveys, they try to answer it the way that you want them to answer it. So they try to read you as they're taking their survey. Who are you? I want you to like me. This is the way people do things.
What is it called again? The
Halo effect. It's a halo effect. Of course, sometimes you get the horn effect, where somebody is a jackass and they want to answer it the opposite way that you want them to answer it. So you get some people that answer it the way that you want them to, some people that answer it the opposite way, and so, which makes surveys not very accurate. So how can you make sure that people aren't trying to make you feel good or bad about them? You can't. There's nothing, no way you can tell. Nothing.
Is that a real thing? The halo and horn effect?
I'm sorry? The horn effect, I just made that.
Oh, but the halo is.
Yeah, the halo effect. We talk about the halo effect. And actually, they should be talking about the opposite effect, but nobody ever does. We like to pretend, because this is how psychological research, we use a lot of surveys. So we want to pretend that they're all very, very accurate. But the reality is they're not.
So like you're saying, like is it like you're conducting a really good workshop and you send it out to people, but there's like that one person in the crowd that don't like you, and
They'll try to mess up your whole thing.
say that. They,
Or you may have everyone, maybe everybody in this class loves me. So if I gave you a survey, everybody but Moses is going to be answering it pretty well. You know, then Moses is going, oh, he's a jackass. He was Air Force. I'm Army, so I'm going to answer the opposite. But everybody else are going, yeah, Bradway's okay. Yeah, maybe he'll give me an A if I answer his questions correctly. You know, these kinds of things happen, unfortunately. Of course, there's always a Mose in every group, so we got a problem.
called
But
the
you-
Mose effect.
It's called the Mose effect, yeah, exactly. It's usually called the Marine effect. It's the Marines that try to screw everything up. She was Army, but she's married to a Marine, so she understands exactly what I'm talking about. They try to mess you up. They did a survey once upon a time called the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance, where they asked all these individuals about their sexual encounters. They asked 9th graders and they asked 12th graders. And then 4 years later, they asked the same group. Now the weird thing was, when they were 9th graders, they said they had a select amount of, this is males, 13-year-old males. They asked them how much intercourse they had, how much sexual intercourse had they had. And they said, well, I've had this much intercourse. Well, when they were 18 years old, and they asked them as seniors how much intercourse they had, all of a sudden it was cut in half. So either they forgot that they had had intercourse when they were in the 9th grade, or they lied when they were 9th graders. And they were more truthful when they were 12th graders. As strange as that may seem. Now in psychology, we talk about the law of threes. One of the laws of threes is that if you ask a male how many women he's had sex with, he'll multiply it times 3. I know. If you ask a female how many men she's had sex with, she'll divide it by 3. So what's the probability you're going to get an accurate answer? And the answer is fairly close to 0. Especially,
Brad always tells the truth.
you always tell the
No,
truth?
you always.
I always tell the truth. Well, I would tell it. Nobody asked me that question, thank God. But when I was a 9th grader, I hadn't had sex with anybody. When I was a 12th grader, I still hadn't had sex with anybody. So I guess, I know. I told you I was boring. Yeah, I've always been boring, unfortunately. Observational studies detect naturally occurring relations among variables. It enables prediction, no direct control over the variables, of course, since this is observational studies. You know, you're watching people wash their hands in a bathroom. You can't force them to wash their hands. You can't control the variables. You can't tell them there's the flu virus is on that urinal handle. You can't tell them that. You can't control the variables at all. So all you can do is watch. And of course, you don't know why they're washing their hands or not washing their hands. So you can't determine causality. Nothing you can do. Where was I? I was driving back from Albuquerque yesterday. I went into a gas station and they had bananas sitting there. You know, and so I'm watching people not picking up any bananas. Observational study. It was an observational study. I wanted to see how many people felt like they needed potassium that day. Nobody is the answer. I know. I was there for about 5 minutes waiting for my wife to come out of the bathroom. And nobody ate any bananas. So I can tell you that for a fact. I didn't eat one either. In observational studies, researchers observe and record the behavior of participants. These studies can be structured and take place in a laboratory. The studies can be unstructured and take place in the natural environment, and of course that's naturalistic observation. I was just talking about watching people either picking up or not picking up a banana in a gas station, naturalistic observation. I was in an environment and I watched people not eat bananas. Of course, some of the bananas, they had 2 baskets of bananas. One of them was green and the other were brown. They had brown spots all over them. And I don't know how you feel about bananas. My mother told me that when she was a kid, they told them that how would that go? If they ate green bananas, they'd get diarrhea. And if they ate bananas with spots on them, so you wanted your bananas always to have spots. They always had to have brown spots on them. If they had brown spots, you were okay. But if you ate green bananas, you'd get sick. Which isn't true at all. I mean, that was just something they talked about back in the 1920s and 1930s, as odd as that seems. Anyway, so they had a basket of bananas with brown spots and a basket of bananas that were kind of green. Nobody ate any bananas. It didn't make any difference. Correlational coefficient, statistical measure of the relationship between 2 variables. The direction, the R value ranges from a -1, negative or an inverse correlation, to a +1, positive correlation. And if you've had Sue or Sarah's class dealing with statistics, you understand what I'm talking about. So a correlational study goes from a -1 to a +1. The more 2 things happen together, the more positive it is. If one thing happens and the other thing never happens, then it's a negative. So the stronger the correlation, the larger the number. That's the way it works. The closer to 0, the less likely there's any correlation. So the stronger the correlation, the larger the number. Doesn't matter if it's a negative number or a positive number. One is a positive correlation, the other is a negative correlation. But the higher the number, the stronger the correlation. R values range from 0, no relationship between the variables, to a 1, a perfect correlation, regardless of the sign, whether it's negative or positive. So the larger the number, the stronger the correlation. The closer to 0, the less likely there is a correlation between the 2 variables. Strength of correlation is determined by how closely points are clustered on a scatter plot. Perfect correlation is one that aligns along a straight line. So this is a much stronger correlation than this is. And of course, that's how you look at correlational studies. You put it on a scatter plot. So the top one has a much stronger correlation than the bottom one. What they were trying to do was, what they correlated was how often Old Faithful erupts, and it's right around the same time, every, 17 minutes or something. And of course, that's what it was. I don't know what this is. Oh, eruption duration. Well, how long it takes. How long it erupts is the bottom correlation. So as you can see, It erupts about every 17 minutes or something like that, 19 minutes, I don't remember. I haven't actually been to Yellowstone. Even though I lived right over there by Yellowstone, we never went. Positive correlations on a scatter plot sweep upward from the lower left to the upper right. Positive correlations. Negative correlations move downward from the upper left to the lower right. So that's what a negative correlation looks like on a scatter plot. Oh, how exciting is that? They were looking at body mass index and hypertension in different places. They were looking at people of African descent. So they were actually looking at people in Nigeria. They were looking at people in Cameroon, people in Jamaica, Santa Lucia, Barbados, and the United States. And they were looking at people of African descent and their body mass index, how it correlated with hypertension. Now the odd thing is that people who are African American, people who are living in the United States, who have African ancestry, they're more likely to have hypertension than people living in Africa. So it is genetic, but it also is environmental, as curious as that is. If you go to Africa and you look at the people in rural Africa, or you look at people that live just in the cities in Africa, they have the same probability of having hypertension as other people in the United States, as everybody in the United States. Their average is about the same as ours is. But if we just look at African Americans, as you can see, their probability of having hypertension is much higher. So what's the difference between people living in Africa and people of African descent living in the United States? What is the difference? What could possibly be the difference? Food. Food. What about the slave ships? That may have been 5 or 10 generations ago, but what about the slave ships? Could they have anything to do with hypertension in the United States? Why are African Americans more likely to have hypertension than if they had stayed in Africa? It turns out that the individuals that were able to survive the voyage from Africa to the United States, or wherever they landed, were the ones who retained salt. I know. The other ones died. I know. So they fell out of the gene pool. Well, the African American gene pool anyway. So African Americans retain salt more than somebody living in Africa. Of course, there, you could be or you couldn't be. It really doesn't make any difference as far as that goes. They got all the water that they wanted. One of the problems was they weren't giving them any water. They weren't even feeding them. It was taking a week, and they didn't give them any water. So the ones that survived were the ones that retained salt. So they have more hypertension. I know, it's so bizarre. Who would have thought? I know. Often when two variables are plotted on a scatter plot, the results don't form a straight line, but a curved line, and this is known as curvilinear, of course. Healthcare usage by age is curvilinear. The young and the old use healthcare more frequently than teenagers and young adults, and for that reason it's curvilinear. When the flu epidemic hits, who are the ones that die? Who dies from the flu? The very old and the very young, exactly. So it's curvilinear, right? Experimental studies are usually conducted in the laboratory. They use statistical comparison of experimental and control groups. Experimental groups, participants who receive the condition or treatment of the interest, and that's known as the independent variable. The control group, the comparison group of participants who receive a different treatment or no treatment whatsoever. And that's how an experimental study works. Sue talks about it all the time. Sarah talks about it all the time. I try not to talk about it I try to talk about it as little as possible. The factor in an experiment that an experimenter manipulates the variable whose effect is being studied is known as the dependent variable. I did my own research to finish my dissertation. It took me a long time to do it. It took me a long time to get it approved. And I never did get it approved, but I did it anyway. And for that reason, I got fired because I did the research even though they told me not to do it. I know, I'm a bad man. I'm unethical. Okay. But I did it anyway. I did it anyway, but of the people I was trying to get approve it, I didn't utilize their population. I utilized another population. But they didn't like the fact that I finished the research, so they got mad at me and fired me. Anyway, my dependent variable was resilience. I was trying to find resilience. I was trying to find if a select population was resilient. I was working up in Montana on a reservation and I wanted to use the native population. But they wouldn't let me use the native population on the reservation. So how did I do it? No, the school's on the reservation. I needed a native population.
Ours.
Good idea, what a great place to go. To find resilience. Go to a bar.
Border towns?
I'm sorry?
Border towns?
Yeah, kinda, yeah, I guess that kind of fits. I used the people living off the reservation. People with Indian names that were living off the reservation. I mean, if you got somebody whose name's Cuts the Rope, you figure, wait a minute, is this guy from Finland? Is he from Sweden? You got a stiff arm. There were lots of stiff arms and donies up there. You know, you got a donie or a stiff arm, you're going, I wonder if they're a native or not. You know, the problem were the Smiths and the Johnsons and the Joneses because they were on the reservation too.
No bear claws?
No, not spelled like Robert spells his name anyway. What else did we have up there? Stiff arms. We had first strikes. Anyway, there were a lot of names that were obvious. It's like Begays and Yazis and Nezes. You know, are they Navajo? I don't know. They could be. Are there any Begays, Nezes, or Yazis off the reservation who aren't native? Is it a Spanish name? It's not a Spanish name. Now the problem would be if you go to the Pueblos, because the Pueblos use a lot of Spanish names. They're Hispanic. Okay, that would be a problem. But this was up in Montana. Not only that, but the people that lived around the reservation were mostly Hungarian, as it turned out. So they had Hungarian names. It was not difficult to figure out which was which. Anyway, so my dependent variable was resilience. My independent variables, I looked at education, I looked at age, I looked at a level of trauma, I looked at culture, and there's one more. I always forget the other one. I don't know. Those were all my independent variables. The behavior or the mental process in an experiment that may change in response to manipulations of the independent variable. Okay, so it's theoretically it changes. So what's the variable in this case? Potentially it's sunlight, maybe it's water, who knows? Maybe they put fertilizer in one side, didn't put fertilizer in the other. And of course the dependent variable would be growth rate, and the independent variable would be sunlight, fertilizer, or amount of water. Dependent variables. So the dependent variable is what you're looking at. In my case, it was resilience. I was trying to prove that the population was resilient. And the reason, are you ready for this? The reason that I wanted to do that was because everybody suggested that I look at all these negative things about American Indians. Alcohol, tobacco, drugs, child abuse. They wanted me to look at negative things. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to say something positive about these people. Everybody and their cousin talks about how they try to stereotype American Indians. And I said I wasn't going to do that. I'm going to find something positive. So I looked at resilience. And one of the things I discovered was that I used an instrument that has been used all over the world, and what I discovered was that this population of American Indians were more resilient than the Germans, they're more resilient than the Russians, they're more resilient than African Americans in the United States, they're more resilient than practically every group that I looked at. The only group that they weren't more resilient than were old people. It was the only group that they weren't more resilient than. All of these studies had used the same instrument all over the world. There was a group in Africa that they did a resilience study, and they had lower levels. The only group were old people. Now, why would old people be more resilient than a population that ran from 18 to 85? Why would old people be more resilient than that? Because they've already lived through all this stuff. Of course they're going to be more resilient. They were also old people in Washington State. I don't know if that has anything to do with it. Assigning research participants to groups by chance to minimize pre-existing differences is known as random sampling. So if I were going to do a random sample in here, I would say I'll pick number 3, number 5, and number 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, I forgot 5. Who's 5? 5. Okay. 3, 5, and 7. Okay. Or I could count from the other way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I got the same. As interesting as that was. But you use random numbers. That's the way it works. That's a random sampling. Snowball sampling in a limited or difficult population. A researcher might make initial contact with a member of the group, and then they will recruit other members, other known members of that group. This is the curious thing. Am I running out of time? Marius is here.
Oh, no, you got enough time.
Okay. Remind me not to say anything negative about Marius. He's in the room. Okay. So if I start to, I pick on him all the time. If that happens, just wave my hand and go, no, he's right there. Snowball sampling is where you find it. You're looking at a difficult population. Let's say I wanted to do research on prostitution in Gallup. Now, I'm betting that there is prostitution in Gallup, but it's illegal. So, in order for me to do any research with prostitution in Gallup, I'd have to find a prostitute, and I'd have to tell that select individual, I would have to ask that select individual, do you have any friends that I can talk to? I'm not going to use names. I'm not going to disclose any information to the police. I'm just trying to do research in dealing with prostitution. So that's the only way I could get any sample. I mean, if I tried to sample everybody in the town of Gallup, I mean, almost everybody that I would sample would not be prostitutes. But I'm looking for prostitutes and I want to find their stories. So I would use a snowball sampling. If I were talking about people that smoke marijuana, well, it's against the law. So people aren't just going to, I can't sample everybody. I can't sample everybody. If I did, I'd get a lot of negative results. But I want to know about people who smoke pot. Why do you smoke pot, or whatever it is? So what I would have to do, I would have to find somebody that admitted that they smoked pot, and then ask them, well, you ask your friends if I can survey them. And that's known as a snowball sampling. Okay, it's the only way you can catch select groups of individuals. Homosexuality used to be against the law. So in order to do any research with people that were homosexual, you had to find somebody who was homosexual, and you had to ask them, to ask their friends, to talk to you. And that's the only way you could do it. How about gang members? If we were looking for gang members, I mean, it's still against the law. These guys do all kinds of interesting things. But in order to find gang members, I can't just survey everybody in this room. How many of you are gang members? I got nobody. They're Marius, I do. So I'd have to ask Marius, go to Snowflake and ask all your friends. Okay, exactly. And that's known as snowball sampling. Census sampling is where you sample everybody in your population. can you do this? Yeah, I did. That's exactly what I did. I was working with 2 different counties in Montana. There were 7,000 people in one county and 5,000 people in the other county. I could discount all the people that were on the reservation because I couldn't use them. So I sampled everybody that had a name that I considered American Indian of all the people in the county. And I sampled, I don't know, what was it? I sent out 1,053 or something. And I got back 154 or something. So I tried to sample people that weren't actually native, or they didn't want to do it.
Was it mail surveys?
It was a mail survey, yeah. I mailed them the surveys. And they either sent it back or didn't. I know. It cost me a little bit of money. Luckily, postage was less back then than it is today. Anyway, it was a census sampling. I was able to sample everybody who wasn't on the reservation. And I wasn't supposed to use anybody on the reservation. So I didn't break any laws, I didn't break any rules. It was ethical as far as I was concerned, as far as my institution was concerned, but as far as the people that employed me, they said that I shouldn't have done it. It was unethical for me to use that population, but I wasn't using that population, was I? I was off the reservation. Okay. Now here's the funny thing, and how much time do I have? When I came here, I told them, look, I had this problem at my last reservation I was on, and I got fired for it. And they said, okay, what you have to do, we're going to hire you, but you have to agree not to do any research. And so I signed a form that said I wouldn't do any research. So I'm not going to do any research. So you can listen to Sue and Sarah talk about research, how they're going to do all this wonderful research. I can't do any research. I've already agreed not to do any research because they considered it unethical. Okay, and that's the answer. If they talk about this stuff and it sounds like they're dancing around my name, that's why they're doing it, okay? Because I can't do research here. Not that I want to do research here, but I told them I didn't want to do it anyway. I'm already a professor, what the hell? In order to become a professor, you have to do research. I know, as odd as that sounds. But I can't do any research. What's a quasi-experiment? A study in which the comparison groups differ on the variables of interest at the outset of the study. For example, active versus sedentary people, women versus men, high versus low socioeconomic status, smokers versus non-smokers. You can compare the two, and this is known as a quasi-experiment. A cross-sectional study is a study comparing representative groups of people of various ages on a particular dependent variable. And that's exactly what I did. I didn't just look at 18-year-olds. I didn't look at 25-year-olds. I looked at everybody. One of the rationales for not letting me do research was that the elders on the reservation didn't want me to. That was the argument. However, 28% of my survey were elders from the reservation, but they were living off the reservation. I know. Wait a minute, you just told me that the elders didn't want me to do this. Well, as it turned out, there was one elder that didn't want me to do it. And the other elders thought it was a good idea. My research had to do with resilience, and the reason I did it was I was trying to show people that this population is resilient. They were having problems with suicide. And if you can make people think a positive thought, like I am resilient, then potentially it could keep them from committing suicide. That was the idea. That's why I did it. And that's why I didn't let them stop me from doing it, because I thought that maybe I could help. Suicide's a really, really serious problem. Who did we, some celebrity talked about suicide. Oh, it was the young girl off of Modern Family. The one with the kidney problems. Yeah, she thought about committing suicide. She had a kidney transplant and it didn't work. And she thought of committing suicide. When she found out she had to go back to dialysis, They had to take the kidney that didn't work out. She has had a second transplant since then. But she was thinking of committing suicide. So my idea was I'm trying to help people keep from committing suicide. And despite the fact that I lost my job and had to leave a place that I loved, Montana, and a population that I had a good time with, it was worth it, because maybe it kept somebody from committing suicide. One person, it doesn't matter, that's all it takes. Anyway, so I was surveying all these individuals, 18-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 50-year-olds. I had an 85-year-old that took the survey. And guess who was the most resilient? The 85-year-old. Yeah, the old people were really resilient. Of course, they'd already lived through all kinds of stuff. The Young Risk Behavior Survey is a cross-sectional study as it looks at students from 4 different years. Remember, it looked at freshmen, it also looked at seniors. And what it discovered was that seniors were more honest than ninth graders. Ninth graders are a bit of braggarts, and they claim that they had more sex than they actually had. Results from the type of research can be considered circumspect because it is assuming that differences will remain constant over time. But the reality is when maybe you have stayed the same over time. But if I look at you now, and I look at a group that was the same age you were 4 years ago, the reality is you're different generations. You have different ideas. If you looked at what I thought when I was your age, 50 years ago, it's not going to be the same, because for one thing, you guys have computers. And you play on your damn telephone all the time. No offense, Mose. We didn't even have telephones you could carry around. We could, but it wasn't attached to anything. Telephones back then were attached to the damn wall by a wire. I know you guys have all this stuff. My wife, I'm sitting in the car, and I said something about Marcus Garvey, and she says, "Google, who is Marcus Garvey?" And so here I am, I'm telling her who Marcus Garvey is, and then she gets it all on Google, and she finds out that I was correct, of course. Anyway, why don't we stop right here? We'll pick this up next time. I'll talk to you guys later.